Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Victoria, the Virginia Director with Chesapeake Climate Action Network. You're here for Greenwashing 101. So CCAN is a climate advocacy nonprofit laser focused on decarbonization and a just, equitable transition to clean energy. I also want to acknowledge and thank our other organizational co-sponsors today, the Virginia Sierra Club, Environment Virginia, the Virginia League of Conservation Voters, Virginia Conservation Network, and Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. So this webinar starts with the premise and the fact that we are in a climate crisis, and it is our duty to provide clean air and a stable planet to our children and their children, or indeed to ourselves and our neighbors. So to do so, we need a rapid transition to clean energy, and that means being able to parse apart energy sources that are and are not actually clean. So we've put together Greenwashing 101 because over the last 3 years, we have seen repeated attempts to not just weaken our climate laws, but efforts from polluting industries to also take advantage of those climate laws, often by trying to capture incentives meant for true, clean, renewable energy sources. While the General Assembly has, for the most part, prevented these legislative attempts, the current governor has generally supported them, and this is the last year of this gubernatorial administration. We expect many of these greenwashed industries to make one last push to capture those incentives or otherwise exempt themselves from regulation. So this is an educational webinar to walk you through what those industries ask for and why they're not actually clean. Specifically today, because these are topics that the legislature has contemplated before, we're discussing biomass, waste to energy, otherwise known as trash incineration, as well as sources of fugitive methane like coal mines and agriculture. So we'll have 3 presentations today, and then we hope there will be time for Q&A. It is likely we won't get to all questions, but we will make sure you have contact info for our speakers to follow up on any pressing questions. We have 3 incredible technical experts with us today, so I'll just ask them to briefly take themselves off mute and introduce yourselves before we get into our presentations. So we'll start with Julie, and then Laura, and then Kevin. And then Kevin, you can go right ahead and launch into your presentation. Thanks very much.
Hi, all. I'm really glad to be here. My name is Julie McNamara. I'm the Deputy Policy Director for the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'm based in Massachusetts. I do a lot of work on federal energy policy, including recently around a lot on carbon accounting and biomethane. So looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for this invitation. Really appreciate it. My name is Laura Haight. I'm the U.S. Policy Director for Partnership for Policy Integrity. We are a very small nonprofit based in Massachusetts. I work from my home in New York. And we were founded about a dozen years ago, largely to counter the false claims of the biomass industry. And we've done work in the past in Virginia, and look forward to continuing to work with you all.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Budris. I'm the Deputy Director at an organization called Just Zero, and I am based in Providence, Rhode Island, although Just Zero is an organization that works on zero waste all across the country. I'm just quickly going to share my slides here as I dive into my presentation, so please bear with me as I navigate this. Great. Thanks, everyone. So as I mentioned, I'm the Deputy Director at an organization called Just Zero, and I'm going to be the first of our presenters here today, and I'm going to focus my presentation on a lot of the greenwashing, a lot of the misinformation that comes with trash incineration, sometimes referred to as waste to energy, as Victoria mentioned, and how real zero waste solutions should be the replacement for false solutions like incineration, landfilling as well, and other types of false solutions that do not prioritize waste reduction, waste diversion, waste elimination. So just a quick word about who we are at Just Zero before I dive in further. We are a relatively new member-supported 501c3 nonprofit organization. It is our mission to work alongside communities like yours and policymakers, scientists, educators, organizers, and others all across the country to implement just and equitable solutions to the waste crisis. We take a holistic approach to our advocacy work, and I'll be touching a little bit at the end of my presentation, a little bit more on what we do for our work. But we both focus on pushing to shut down dangerous, antiquated waste facilities like trash incinerators and landfills, while also pushing back against some of the quote unquote new false solutions, things like chemical recycling, gasification, pyrolysis, etc., while also advancing policy solutions that stop waste before it starts. As I mentioned today, I'm going to be talking both about how trash incineration is toxic, climate damaging, and unjust, while busting many of those greenwashed myths around incineration. And then I'm also going to focus again on those real zero waste solutions to the waste crisis that we're in. So as I dive in first on waste incineration, it is important to frame this in that waste crisis itself, because according to the US Environmental Protection Agency, we as a country are producing about 300 million tons of municipal solid waste each year. Municipal solid waste includes waste from our homes, waste from businesses, restaurants, other commercial entities. It's a lot of the waste that is in our day-to-day lives, what we typically think of as trash. Does not include things like industrial waste. And that estimate by US EPA, that 300 million tons, there's good evidence out there that that is a significant underestimate. We may be talking more in the range of 500 million or more tons of municipal solid waste that's actually being generated in this country each year. And I have a pie chart up here on this next slide, and I'm going to be returning to this throughout the presentation because it's important to recognize what's in our waste, and specifically what's in the waste that we're burning. The figures in this pie chart come, again, from US EPA, and it's a breakdown on the general categories of waste that are going to trash incinerators all across the country. Now, that may vary a little bit from incinerator to incinerator, but the picture is roughly the same at each incinerator in the country. And you can take one look at this slide and start to kind of grasp what the problem is here. Because so much of what we're burning is paper, plastic, glass, metal, food waste, and other organic waste like yard trimmings. These are the types of wastes that in some instances shouldn't exist in the first place, or that we have better solutions for when it comes to pivoting to reuse, doing a better job with recycling, diverting as much of this waste as possible. Because the end result, when we burn all of what's in this pie chart, all this waste breakdown here, is toxic. Now, compared to coal-fired power plants, which are often held up as the most toxic, most dangerous, most climate-damaging way to generate energy, incinerators emit more mercury, lead, dioxins, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, particulate matter, and a host of other dangerous pollutants. So in most of the key ways, burning trash to generate energy, so-called, again, waste to energy, which is itself a greenwashed phrase, because we're really talking about burning trash here. Waste to energy is a less efficient, more dangerous way of generating energy than burning coal. Despite this reality, the waste industry, the fossil fuel industry, and many folks out there that are doing their bidding like to spread a number of greenwashed myths about trash incineration. Chief among them is that modern incinerators are somehow safe or that they comply with emissions limits. The safety claim is frankly not true because these permit limits that incinerators are supposedly complying with are based on available technology, not health standards. So when in their emissions permit, an incinerator is required to comply with certain limits, those limits are basically based on what the incinerator can do, not on what would be safe for residents living near this incinerator. And on top of that, incinerators don't continuously monitor for the most hazardous pollutants. Their compliance with these emissions limits is evaluated based on snapshots, so-called stack tests that they're doing several times throughout the year. At any minute of any day, they don't actually know whether they're complying with emissions limits, especially for the most toxic emissions like dioxins. And most incinerators are 30 plus years old. That includes the Reworld or Covanta incinerator in Northern Virginia. That means that they require frequent shutdowns, startups, maintenance, and importantly, incinerators in their permits are exempt from most of the emissions limits during those periods of startup, shutdown, or maintenance. So you've got old incinerators that are constantly turning on and off, undergoing maintenance, and they're just skating by these emissions limits. That's far from safe. On top of all of that, it's important to note that pollution control devices at these incinerators don't actually eliminate harmful emissions. In some cases, they reduce those emissions, but the toxics end up somewhere. And most of the time where those toxics that aren't going up the stacks end up in incinerator ash. Because contrary to a lot of the misinformation spread about incinerators do not obviate the need for landfills. About 25% of the weight of incoming waste at an incinerator is left over as toxic ash. That ash must then be landfilled. That ash contains toxics like dioxins, lead, mercury, PCBs, similar to emissions from incinerators. When that ash is landfilled, those landfills generate leachate, which is kind of the toxic garbage brew that percolates through landfills. All landfills leak, as recognized by EPA, and the leachate that's not leaking out of a landfill is frequently piped or trucked to a wastewater treatment facility that is not treating water for toxics like dioxins, lead, mercury, PCBs, and also PFAS. All of these things are then ending up back in our environment as toxic pollutants. Another myth, and one of the big myths that we're here to talk about today with a wide variety of the industries that we're talking about, is that incinerators somehow generate renewable energy, which is so very far from the truth. Because the fact of the matter is that an incinerator's fuel source, quote unquote, is trash. There is nothing renewable about our trash. These incinerators depend on carbon to burn in their furnaces. A lot of that carbon comes from things like plastics, which are sourced from fossil fuels, which is definitely not a form of renewable energy. On top of that, incinerators create a demand for waste. Once you build one of these things, you have to feed the beast. You have to keep pumping trash to the incinerator. That creates a perverse incentive and actually is a significant roadblock to reducing waste up front, which on the whole is a much bigger benefit for the climate. And as Victoria mentioned earlier, there have been attempts in Virginia to kind of capture those incentives that are meant for truly renewable energy. That is 100% the case when it comes to incineration across the country, because more than half of states in the US actually allow incinerators to claim subsidies intended for renewables through what's called renewable portfolio standards, which is preposterous because burning trash is, in fact, acutely climate damaging. When you factor in both non-biogenic and biogenic emissions, those are emissions that come from things like paper product, food waste, yard trimmings that are in our waste stream. Burning trash generates more carbon dioxide, again, than burning coal, which we typically think of as the most climate damaging way of generating electricity. And when incinerator companies and their proponents try to kind of play funny math and claim that incinerators are good for the climate, they're often using landfills as a point of comparison, saying, well, at least in incinerators, we're avoiding methane emissions. But as I'm going to talk about in a second, landfills are not the proper point of comparison here. Landfills and incinerators are not our only choice when it comes to addressing our waste. Another big myth is, of course, that incinerators are good neighbors, which, especially in light of the litany of studies that have shown that communities that live near incinerators suffer from elevated rates of lead poisoning, asthma, cancers, and other ailments associated with the very pollutants that incinerators emit, it is clear that incinerators are not, in fact, good neighbors. And it is important to point out here that these burdens that especially come in communities that live near incinerators are not borne equally across the country, because burning trash is unjust and it is inequitable. Nationwide, about 79% of all trash incinerators are located in environmental justice communities. Historically marginalized communities of color, low-income communities, and communities of limited English-speaking proficiency. And then there's the biggest myth of all, that waste is inevitable, that it just has to go somewhere, that we're forced to deal with all of this waste in our lives, so we've just got to choose between burying it or burning it. But when we talk about waste being inevitable and having to go somewhere, it's important to point out that somewhere is a real place. And across the US, 76 million people live within 3 miles of a landfill or incinerator. Real people in real communities that are bearing the brunt of the harm that comes when we get stuck into this false dichotomy, this false myth that waste is just going to exist and we've got to choose to burn it or bury it. Because there is no good choice between burning and burying. Both landfilling and trash incineration are climate damaging, they are poisonous, they are toxic, they are risky, and they are expensive. So, what are the real solutions? If these are false solutions, if this is a false dichotomy, what is the way out of this? Zero waste. So what is zero waste? This is a term that has entered the zeitgeist in a certain number of ways. People talk about zero waste a lot. And the good thing is that there is an internationally recognized definition of zero waste that was drafted by the Zero Waste International Alliance. It is a great definition. It encapsulates a lot of what we're talking about. It is also a mouthful. I'm going to boil this definition down to kind of the key focus that we in particular at Just Zero like to look at when we talk about zero waste. And that's that zero waste means stopping waste before it starts. It means looking at this pie chart and identifying the ways in which we can eliminate, reduce, divert, recycle, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the things that are in our waste stream so that we aren't boxed in between burying that waste or burning that waste. Before I dive a little deeper into that pie chart, it's important to recognize what zero waste isn't. Zero waste isn't individual choices. A lot of times people think about zero waste as, oh, someone who on their own in their home is doing as much as possible to fit their weekly trash into a mason jar, something like that, which is important. Individual choices matter. They're an important step on the pathway to real solutions, but they're not the end result. The end result is big policy changes that get us there. Zero waste is not an undue emphasis just on recycling. We cannot recycle our way out of the trash crisis. It is a part of it. It is not the whole. It also isn't any other greenwash program that puts a polluter in control. It's not other ways of burning trash like so-called advanced recycling or chemical recycling. Zero waste to landfill, circular economy for plastics, any other thing that's not actually prioritizing waste reduction, but is putting polluters in the driver's seat as they have been for decades and centuries. So then what is zero waste? Zero waste is organic waste diversion and composting. Over a third of what's in this waste pie chart of what we're burning in incinerators across the country is food waste or other organics like yard trimmings. So much can be done to divert that waste through food rescue, food donations, composting programs. This third really does not belong in incinerators or landfills at all, and we have solutions to divert and eliminate that waste. Zero waste is packaging reduction, reuse, and recycling. That paper, plastic, glass, metal, across this whole pie chart, about 20% of what's in our waste stream is some type of single-use packaging or a single-use container. Laws and policies that require producers and consumer brands to reduce their packaging, to fund better reuse and recycling infrastructure go a long way to eliminating that 20% so it doesn't end up in landfills and incinerators. As do bottle bills or deposit return programs, where you put a deposit on a single-use beverage container, you get that back when you bring it back for the bottle to be, or can, to be recycled or reused. These programs work in the 10 states in this country and in the countries all across the world that implement these programs. They do a lot to keep these containers that are a significant portion of our waste stream out of incinerators and landfills. Zero waste also means single-use plastic bans, things like bag bans, polystyrene foam bans. They help trim that plastic part of the waste stream. Zero waste means pay-as-you-throw programs, the types of programs where you pay per bag of trash that you throw away. These programs have been proven across the country to reduce the waste stream by 40 to 60% within a year. That's a big deal. That is eliminating waste that did not need to be there in the first place. Across the board, these types of big programs and policies are the real solutions. Instead of talking about choosing between landfilling and incineration and which one is worse, we need to be talking about what are the real things that can stop waste before it starts. And just one more word as I wrap up. Again, this is specifically what we work on at Just Zero. One of the new tools that we've launched in the past few months on our website are model legislative toolkits that allow communities like yours through an interactive and customizable interface to build the policy proposals that you want, starting with the issues you'd like to address. We are here at Just Zero to help. There's a link here to our email sign up. My contact information will go around. I hope all of you reach out if you have any questions to kind of further dive down this issue of what we can do to push back against incineration myths and in their place, put in place real zero waste solutions. And with that, I thank you so much. And I think we are on to the next speaker before we do Q&A.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Kevin. We're moving to Laura.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen, get my slide going from the beginning. Hopefully it'll work. Oh, of course it doesn't work. There we go. Sorry about that. My name is Laura Haight, again with a Partnership for Policy Integrity. And I'm here to talk about a different type of incineration. It's mostly incineration of wood. Biomass energy is a term that really refers to a broad range of fuels, including the biomass portions of garbage that's burned. Much of that is organic and is considered also biomass. Certain crops, landfill gas, and whatnot. But I'm going to be talking about woody biomass energy. And just to check, can everyone hear me? Because I'm feeling invisible here.
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'm going to be talking about wood and wood wastes, which is relevant to Virginia. Biomass power plants. Oops. Oh, am I still on? Or did I stop sharing?
Yep, you're still sharing.
Oh boy. Biomass power plants are extremely inefficient. The average efficiency is only about 25%. That means most of the energy in the fuel is lost. And most of that goes out the stack as CO2. For every ton of wood burned, there's approximately a ton of CO2 that goes up the stack. Now, because they're so inefficient, they emit far more CO2 per megawatt hour than coal or gas facilities. I do want to say that the slide that Kevin shared with Neil Tangri, we don't quite understand. Actually, I and my science director, Neil, were in touch about that, why those biomass emissions showed up as less than coal, because I need to get back to Neil on that. It's about 50% higher per unit of energy than coal, and biomass plants, garbage incinerators rather, are even worse in terms of CO2. Likewise, per megawatt hour, biomass power plants are far more polluting in terms of harmful health pollutants than coal or gas, of course, other than, in coal's case, sulfur dioxide. There's other harms from biomass power plants, local dust, soot, fugitive emissions. In some cases, biomass power plants, well, claims to be wood, they're burning tires, railroad ties, and in fact, are not even regulated as stringently as garbage incinerators. This Lance Warden plant in Michigan should have been regulated as a garbage incinerator based on what it was burning. And of course, there's the forest impacts. Even in a best case scenario where there's, some level of sustainable harvesting, you're removing wood from the forest and also losing a lot of carbon from the soils. And then there's the worst case scenario, which we see a lot of in the Southeast, is basically strip mining these lands for what's considered low value wood that can't be used as saw timber, but in some cases might be valuable habitat, certainly a wonderful form of storage. And I'm just having a problem. I just need to move my, it's blocking the headings. Okay. I don't know why I'm still seeing a little little bar on this.
Well, we're seeing your slides very well.
Okay, yeah, it's just distracting me, this little bar. But anyway, I've moved it down to the bottom. I think all of my headings are on the top. So Dogwood Alliance, which is a wonderful partner in the Southeast, has documented, real atrocities. And this is largely for wood pellet manufacture for the export markets. But the thing about biomass logging, which is different than other types of logging, is you can go in and take everything and use it for the biomass wood pellets and chips. It doesn't have to be, perfectly straight. And so you see sort of moonscapes like this in the worst case scenarios. I don't know what that is. So another point, while trees are considered renewable, they do take a long time to grow back. And I'll be coming back to the issue of time quite a lot in this presentation as I look at the time to see how much time I have. This is, is to fuel, say, one of the 3 biomass power plants that Dominion has going, 51 megawatt power plants that they have in Alta Vista, Southampton, and I've got my list someplace else. They're 51 megawatt power plants, and it would take one of these 25-acre clear cuts less than a day to this would power one of those plants for less than a day, and they don't grow back quickly. So now that we know that biomass energy is polluting, it's harmful to communities, it's certainly damaging to forests. Why are we calling it clean energy, and what's driving it? Well, partly because they have access to renewable energy incentives, the same as solar and wind. Partly because it's biomass is not fossil fuels, so virtually every emissions trading program, in fact, every emissions trading program that I know of, exempts biomass CO2 emissions from qualifying under the cap. There's a lot of pressure to shut down coal plants, and it's very easy to convert a coal plant to burning wood. And then many policies inaccurately treat it as carbon neutral or zero emission, which again gives it a leg up over fossil fuels and puts it on par with true clean energy solutions and renewables, but it gets the same benefits. And of course, there's the industry lobby pushing for it. And as I say, the biomass industry lobby has never seen a subsidy they didn't like. And these were a lot of the drivers that drove Dominion to change over, to sort of revive its coal plants and change them over to biomass in 2013. Alta Vista, Hopewell, and Southampton. And they went from 63 megawatt to 51 megawatt, which is kind of an indicator, again, of the inefficiency of biomass power. And so what's holding bioenergy back? In the US, it's dollars. This chart shows, and I apologize for all these numbers, that on a levelized cost of electricity, biomass is far more expensive than virtually almost all of the other sources of energy, and more than double wind, onshore wind, and standalone solar. And these were the factors that led in 2018 for Dominion to actually close down its Pennsylvania biomass plant, which was one of the largest in the country, and to scale back how often it ran the other 3 to about 10% a year. In Europe, however, it's another story. There, they really have very strong policy drivers for biomass energy as penalties on countries if they don't meet their renewable energy targets. And the subsidies are significant. And consequently, over the past 10 years, you've seen a huge growth in biomass as part of the renewable energy mix. And wood is about 60% now of Europe's renewable energy, which is unfortunate because of the carbon emissions, as well as the impacts on our forests, which we need for carbon sequestration. I'm not sure how much time I have to go into some of the emissions issues. But biomass is treated very differently from fossil fuels in a number of ways. For one thing, with biofuels, you're looking at net emissions, which is the amount of stack emissions minus whatever is either absorbed by new growth or would have been avoided by not having it decay. So even though it's well known that biomass is more polluting than fossil fuels, many of the net emissions analyses show that it's less, but that's over a period of time. And then life cycle analysis will also include emissions from harvesting, production, and transportation. So why is it considered carbon neutral? The myth is that the biomass carbon, you burn the tree, the carbon dioxide goes up into the air, and then the trees absorb it back, and it's a beautiful circle as opposed to fossil fuels, which go straight from the earth into the atmosphere. The atmosphere doesn't see the difference. It's still CO2 from the atmosphere's perspective. The reality is that what happens with biomass is what we want to see is wind or solar, reduce the stop the burning, let the trees grow. Under fossil fuel scenario, you're burning and releasing CO2, but at least these trees are still growing. In the biopower scenario, you've got the worst case scenario where you're emitting even more CO2 out the stack, and there's fewer trees to absorb it. I'm going to skip this. A groundbreaking study in Massachusetts found that it takes to convert, if you convert coal to biomass, you're going to actually have many, many more years of emissions. It takes over 45 years of new tree growth to absorb enough CO2 to even achieve parity with the coal emissions. Of course, it depends on whether you're burning whole trees or logging residues. And more recent research has shown an even greater variance depending on what assumptions you use. If you assume that the trees all grow back, you will reach parity in, say, maybe 80 years. If not, it could keep on going. So this is, the models have a lot of variables. Virginia's law allows woody biomass to qualify if it's only forest product manufacturing residuals, including biomass, which is like forestry, treetops, trimmings, and whatnot. And we know that that's not really what's the case. Virginia is assuming that there's no additional logging to feed the biomass power plants, but like Kevin said, with garbage incinerators, you need to feed the beast. And we know that whole trees are going into it. But even if only two forest wastes were burned, you still can't say there's not going to be carbon emissions or that it's carbon neutral. It's a matter of time, and which I'm running out of. So this chart shows, for instance, if you're looking in the right column with power, let's compare it to natural gas because we don't really want to be burning coal. Under no scenario in 100 years, whether you're burning harvest residues, salvage trees, young trees, old trees, under no scenario in the first 100 years will you have emissions that are less, cumulative net emissions that are less than burning of the fuel. The only scenario is if you were going to burn that harvest residues at the bottom, if you're going to burn it, right away instead in the forest floor instead of leaving it to decay naturally. Likewise, Virginia requires sustainable harvesting. Sustainable harvesting is not a proxy for biomass carbon neutrality. And in addition, there's a lot of other pressures on Southeast forests in terms of the wood pellet industry and other wood manufacturing industry. Dogwood Alliance has shown whole trees going to these wood pellet mills. The last thing I've heard that methane is being used as an argument to support biomass energy. That is laughable. When wood decays in forests, it tends to decay very slowly and as CO2. And where you really will see what methane will be in these giant piles of wood pellets, sometimes 30, 40, 50 feet deep. where they're anaerobic conditions, which are ripe for methane production. This is a wood pellet mill. You also have that same situation, the power plants. And it's been a big issue with transportation. I'm not familiar with issues on trucks, but the tankers taking wood pellets overseas to Europe have had, a lot of problems with fires and explosions, again, from the buildup of methane and dust. So that's where the methane is, folks. It's when you chop the trees down and grind them up and stack the pellets or chips into huge piles, then you get the methane. So what's the solution to where do we want to go for net zero? This chart doesn't take us far enough because it ends at 2020. We have to keep on going, but what we need to do is decrease fossil fuel emissions, certainly not increase emissions by burning wood. We need to grow our forests so that they can take up more of the CO2 in the atmosphere, and that will lead to, decline in net emissions. So in order to address the twin global crises of climate change and the biodiversity loss, we really need to protect our forests and not burn them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. We'll move to Julie.
Thanks all. Great to be with you today. As I shared earlier, my name is Julie McNamara, and just confirming you can see my slides. Great, I'll take that as a yes. So I'm going to be focusing primarily on biomethane and fugitive methane, and really both trying to give a bit of a context for where and how these resources come about, why they're being even discussed as a possible, how they might fit within a clean energy transition, and then really focusing on identifying the risks of polluter loopholes, because that's the big outstanding issue here. So first, just a little bit about sources, and beyond that, really nomenclature. So when it comes to questions of biomethane, this is really getting at organic material that's broken down in the absence of oxygen, sometimes referred to as anaerobic digestion. This is organic matter like, so as Kevin talked through landfill, right? So landfill materials, animal manure, this is particularly a topic of conversation with dairies, but it can occur with other animals as well. Really anything you can put in an anaerobic digester. So this includes then other residues. This can also come from landfill wastes. But all these things have a range of different names. So when the breakdown of the materials first happens, you get a product referred to often as biogas. This is roughly half methane, and the rest is other gases, including CO2. When that is processed, it then is referred to as biomethane, and that's cleaning up the system so that it's mostly methane. Now that becomes functionally indistinguishable from fossil methane, right? That which is flowing through our gas pipelines. Today, I'm going to talk about this as biomethane, but industry often refers to this as RNG, or renewable natural gas. We try not to talk about that because this ultimately is not a renewable source of natural gas. We also try to say gas, not natural gas, but it is often used, so it's good to be aware of that. Second is fugitive methane. So this really refers to methane emissions that arise from fossil-based activities. So that includes discussion of methane that leaks from gas pipelines, gas processing, right? We know that methane emissions are a big problem from the gas system. There's some discussion of talking about methane that leaks and capturing that, calling that a source of fugitive methane. I'll definitely get into that a little bit later, what's problematic about that. And then coal mine methane, which I know is a point of conversation, especially in Virginia, but this is methane that's released as a result of coal mining operations. So all of these different resources all getting at basically an alternative source of methane. So why do we even talk about fugitive methane, biomethane? Well, methane is a very serious climate forcing pollutant. What I mean by that is when you look on a 100-year time frame, methane is on the order of 28 to 36 times more powerful as a global warming pollutant than carbon dioxide. When we look on a 20-year time frame, which I'll draw your attention to, all of our mid-century targets are just about 20 years away, right? Getting darn close. It is 84 to 87 times more powerful than CO2. So when we talk about how to take strong, important near-term action, driving down methane emissions is a critical piece of this. So when we know that methane is being released from various human-caused activities, we should be addressing it. Now, the first way that methane is managed is through venting. And that's really a loose use of the term managed, because venting is just what happens when we don't do anything about it. Now, there are ways you can do controlled venting, including for safety reasons, like in coal mines, but venting effectively means methane goes in and methane goes out. Then you have methane in the atmosphere. Flaring takes that methane and burns it, turning it into carbon dioxide. Now, if you recall in the previous slide, right, comparing methane, CH4, and carbon dioxide, CO2, CO2 is much less significant as a global warming pollutant. So converting methane to carbon dioxide can have a climate benefit. The final option is capturing that methane and putting it to productive use, which is essentially, instead of just burning it on site, taking the methane and putting it to use to be burned further down the line or as a feedstock, right? In all the ways that we use methane today. I'll note that of these three ways, much as Kevin's talk focused on, it omits the most important question of all: could that methane have been avoided in the first place? And so often the answer is yes. Now, if the methane could not have been avoided in the first place, then we should always be working to, at bare minimum, be capturing it and putting it to productive use. But if we are not first asking every single time, could that methane have been avoided to begin with, or more efficiently been avoided, then we are asking and setting up the wrong policies that ultimately risk driving increased methane emissions, not reduced methane emissions. And here's why that's so important, right? So the pitch is, you can understand the climate math, but this is ultimately a much more complex picture when it comes to fugitive methane and all its potential drawbacks. And I'll try to step through these pretty quickly, just giving a bit of a lay of the land and really giving dairies and coal mine methane as some examples. So first, policies that are incentivizing the use of biomethane, fugitive methane, risk driving an increase in the production of the very harmful waste that they were attempting to harness. And so I'd like to focus here especially on the word harmful. So when we think of, for example, dairies, it's not just about the manure that is, or the methane coming from the manure, that is a problem. In fact, that's one of the, that's very low on the list when it comes to the real harms that come from these facilities, including local air pollution. That the way that dairy manures can capture their waste is by effectively just putting a tarp over a big manure lagoon. That allows for the capture of methane. That does nothing to address the local air pollutants like volatile organic compounds, nor does it do anything about local waterways, damage to local waterways, which can be incredibly harmful. So even if we manage to address the methane problem, this solution does nothing to address the far more concerning and damaging issues associated with the processes that create that methane in the first place. The second is that these policies can subsidize perpetuation of fossil assets. So think about coal mine methane. Now, if a coal mine was moving towards retirement, but is now propped up through funds that subsidize or incentivize the capture of methane, then that coal mine may well stick around simply to continue to produce methane. Now, that capturing and using that methane will never be as good for the environment as avoiding the production of that methane to begin with. So the idea that we could be keeping these things around simply because of incentives is incredibly damaging to the climate. But there's another angle about subsidizing the perpetuation of fossil assets that's important to consider too. It's not just about the coal mine methane, but it's actually about the gas system that we already have in place today, those things that transport gas and then use gas. Because when we start calling methane, quote, clean, then we start risking the incentive to further invest in today's fossil assets. Things like gas pipelines, those things that are already leaking, that we know are a climate problem, that we should be actively moving away from. Those things where we have real and true clean energy alternatives like direct electrification of our homes and businesses. Instead, this presents this type of dead-end pathway, right, where we're going to be instead perpetuating investments in fossil system infrastructure instead of pivoting away. Next, we risk rewarding net polluting projects as clean, and this is a really critical thing to understand. So often, policies focus just on the narrow piece of the climate problem. For example, methane being released from manure lagoons. But that misses the much bigger picture of all the different climate contributors, both at dairies, so beyond just the methane that's released, but also that which is left behind, called often referred to as digestate, as well as the methane that can then leak out of pipelines and the capture system that's being used to produce that biomethane. Well, that can ultimately tip the scale such that that which is seen as a climate solution is actually, again, still a climate problem. Finally, this risks opening the door to polluter greenwashing. And I know that's the very subject of today's talk, which is spot on. And this I want to spend just a little bit more time on. So especially with the idea of, quote, avoided emissions. Now, Laura spoke a bit about life cycle emissions, and Kevin talked about this too. But the idea is really getting back to when I first showed the difference between methane and carbon dioxide as global warming pollutants, right? So methane has a much more significant heat trapping potential in the near term than carbon dioxide. Under certain accounting frameworks, and especially those that industry is pushing, industry is attempting to credit biomethane with the avoidance of methane to the atmosphere. So thinking about the difference between methane and CO2 and giving credit to all of that. If you are to capture and divert methane from going up into the atmosphere, then giving it credit for all of the avoided emissions that would have otherwise occurred. This is in no other terms a polluter offset. This is an offset system, because what it is saying is that it gives credit for avoiding emissions that could have been avoided in the first place, and it allows other polluters to claim those credits. This is incredibly problematic in a net zero framework, which is what countries around the world have committed to under the Paris Agreement, right? Every source of pollution counts when you move to a net zero framework. If we set up policies today that credit certain sources of pollution with avoiding emissions, and then allow other polluters to offset their pollution with those credits, then you still have a full set of polluters online. Ultimately, the math doesn't add up in a net zero framework, but that would risk designing investments and driving investments in dead-end technologies, right? That which does not ultimately bear out in a net zero framework. And so they're just a final look at some of the key industries that are really seeking to use and take advantage of these offset loopholes. So first, the power sector. Think of the gas plants all around this country, right? These are running on gas. The solutions available to them, first and foremost, just run less. Second, there's been discussion of carbon capture, of using hydrogen. But the simplest solution, and all of this, of course, we know must be in the context of building out renewables to fully drive out gas plants altogether. But these gas plants and utilities are starting to confront, right, ever more stringent requirements to drive down their emissions. What they are looking to achieve is a crediting of biomethane with these avoided emissions credits, which would allow them to blend just 6% biomethane into their mix and claim a net zero system. Now, depending on how you do that crediting, it could be up to 25%. The point is that it takes no change in real input. It's still going to be a gas plant. It's still going to have the same amount of CO2 emissions coming out the stack. But because of paper accounting premised on flawed offsets, these gas plants would now be able to call themselves zero emissions. That's incredibly, incredibly concerning. It also risks fully undermining the drive towards the actual clean solutions that get us to where we need to go, the build out of wind and sun, right? Those resources are the ones that we can premise our future on. These ones, building or allowing for gas plants to continue to run on flawed carbon accounting premises alone is a dead-end system. This is the same bears out for gas distribution utilities, right? And these are, while we know that electrification of our stoves, of our ovens, or our converting to heat pumps, right, from furnaces, direct electrification is overwhelmingly the most efficient, cleanest opportunity for transitioning away from fossil fuels. But gas distribution utilities are highly motivated, once again, to try to get renewable natural gas, biomethane, fugitive methane, to count as a climate solution instead, which would allow them to claim credit for just a small share of purchases that would offset the remainder of the emissions within the pipeline. That would continue to be a gas pipeline, still leaking methane and still with all the health-harming pollutants in the homes when that gas is burned. But they would just now be able to call it clean. Once again, that would be driving investments in a dead-end technology. And finally, industry more broadly, right? And this is looking at all those industries that run on fossil fuels today that have better, cheaper, safer, cleaner alternatives, but instead are looking to just delay the inevitable by claiming credit of use of biomethane instead of doing the work of actually transitioning to those clean technologies, right? Like electrification of process heat. And I want to just draw your attention before we then move to questions to two very live policies right now at the federal level that are just to underscore how much this is a pitched battle. Industry is fighting both in a lucrative new clean hydrogen production tax credit, as well as in a new set of tech neutral clean electricity tax credits to have biomethane receive this negative carbon accounting score, right? So this offset system, because that would unlock an enormous amount of incentive for them to capture, which was intended to be going towards truly clean technologies, but instead would subsidize today's fossil systems instead. So this is a very live issue and one that requires very close attention to ensure that we don't shift that money that's meant to drive us forward to subsidize the past instead.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all three of our speakers. We're now going to take a look at the Q&A box. So if you continue to have questions, feel free to put them in here and we'll start with what we've got. So first, a question for perhaps for Kevin. What cities have the best zero waste programs and what % diversion from disposal are they achieving?
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. That's a great question. So a number of cities have kind of engaged in attempts to implement robust zero waste programs. Austin, Texas is one that's often held up. That's held up as an example. Austin, a number of years ago, went through a whole process and implemented a zero waste program. Their goal is to hit 90% diversion by the year 2040, or I should say 90% reduction in their overall waste generation by the year 2040. As of 2021, they were above 40%. I think they had hit 42%. So they're on their way to that goal. Other places, especially at the city and town level, two of the most effective things that cities and towns can do is implement composting drop-off or pickup programs, or I should say food waste drop-off or pickup programs, as well as pay-as-you-throw programs. The city of Portland, Maine implemented both of those things, and within a few years, they had reduced their overall waste generation by more than 60%. So I would say that Portland and Austin are two good indicative examples. If folks are interested in other kind of case study research on this, I'm happy to forward some of those resources along.
Thanks so much. Another question perhaps for you on the burning trash is toxic slide. Do incinerators generate more toxins than coal per kilowatt hour generated, per hour, per year, per ton of input? What is the unit that you're looking at there?
That they generate more toxics than coal per kilowatt hour of energy generated. That's a unit there. Sorry for any confusion on that.
And then for Julie, a question just about what terminology is appropriate to use. For underground methane, do you use fossil gas? Is that the correct term?
That can be an effective term. I think this is always a question of audience and knowing your audience where you are, but that can be a really effective term. Yes.
And then I'm not sure who this is for, but the question is, do you have any information on harvesting rare earth metals from coal ash? We'll possibly get back to that person on that question, so I'm not sure who that's for. A question for you, Laura. Why does biomass result in such higher emissions versus fossil fuels? Is that driven more by lower efficiency of burning, reduced carbon sequestration, or something else?
Well, in terms of the direct emissions, it's because the wood fuel itself is has a high moisture content, so it just takes more energy to utilize as a fuel. The wood pellets that are shipped overseas to Europe are dried in advance, so they actually burn more efficiently. But their life cycle emissions are higher than wood pellets because of all the heat used to dry them before they're burned.
Thanks, Laura. So we are just about running out of time, and I want to make sure we wrap up. Again, I want to thank all of our co-sponsors and our speakers that joined us here today. We are going to send the recording out to all participants as well as slides if you would like them. And we'll include the contact information for our speakers if you continue to have questions as you're sort of mulling over what you've learned today. But again, thanks so much to everyone that's joined, our speakers, our co-hosts, and we hope you'll keep an eye out as we start to get towards the legislative session, understanding that some of these industries are going to be looking for the exact loopholes that we talked about here today. Thanks, everyone.